Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the recent upsurge in violence in Afghanistan is unacceptable. Speaking in Washington, Pompeo said Kabul and the Taliban should initiate talks on releasing prisoners under the Doha peace deal.
The US-Taliban peace deal calls for the release of 5,000 Taliban detainees, but Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has refused to do so. In response, the Taliban announced the resumption of attacks on Afghan security forces, resulting in violent clashes. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the violence must be stopped for the peace process to move forward. He also termed the ICC's decision to open a probe into Afghan war crimes reckless. The ICC's decision will allow a probe into alleged atrocities committed by the Taliban, Afghan government forces, and the US. Meanwhile, the Taliban have rejected reports suggesting that they have some secret pact with the US. In a tweet, Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen said such rumors are not based on reality.
Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says the extremist ideology of India's BJP government poses a threat to global peace. He was speaking at an international seminar on global strategic threat and response in Islamabad. Deploring the grave human rights situation there, Foreign Minister Qureshi said India has become an intolerant state. Talking about the US-Taliban deal, Qureshi said Pakistan has played a significant role for peace in Afghanistan. He said Islamabad will neither become part of any conflict nor will it allow its soil to be used against any other country. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei urges the Indian government to stop Hindu extremists from massacring Muslims. He took to Twitter to deplore the killing of 77 people, mostly Muslims, during protests against the disputed citizenship law. Khamenei said India must stop the violence in order to prevent isolating itself from the Muslim world. Earlier, Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif dubbed the atrocities against Indian Muslims as senseless hooliganism. Other countries, including Malaysia and Turkey, have also condemned the Delhi violence in India. Indian troops have martyred another Kashmiri youth in occupied Kashmir's Baramulla district. Occupation forces martyred the civilian during a cordon and search operation. The civilian, identified as Umar Subhan, was targeted in district's Sopore area. Occupying forces have martyred 32 civilians in the valley in the past 2 months. The valley is reeling under India's curfew for the last 214 days. The Freedom in the World 2020 report has ranked India among the least free democracies in the world. The forum says clampdown in occupied Kashmir and controversial Citizenship Act are the main reasons for the lowest ranking. In the report, the body ranks India at the 83rd position, along with Timor-Leste and Senegal at the bottom of the table. It said India's score fell by 4 points. That is the worst decline among the world's 25 largest democracies this year. The US-based body said the Indian government has distanced itself from the country's commitment to pluralism and individual rights. It slammed the internet blackout in occupied Kashmir, terming it the longest shutdown ever imposed by a democracy. The body said freedom of expression is under threat in India, with journalists, academics, and others facing harassment and intimidation. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Ankara and Moscow must strengthen their ties to resolve the crisis in Syria. He was speaking ahead of talks with the Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Erdogan said the meeting will ease tensions in the region. Putin said the situation in Idlib has escalated to such a point that it requires direct talks between Turkey and Russia. He also offered his condolences to Erdogan over the fallen Turkish soldiers in Idlib. Putin said the Syrian military was not aware of the Turkish soldiers' whereabouts. The fighting between the Turkish and the Syrian troops have caused several casualties on both the sides. 15 people were killed in Russian airstrikes in Idlib in the latest violence to rattle the region. The United Nations has urged Russia and Turkey to find an immediate diplomatic solution to the conflict in northwestern Syria. At a meeting in Cairo, the UN envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, said Ankara and Moscow must find a solution to spare the suffering of the civilians. Pedersen described direct clashes between the Syrian and the Turkish militaries in Idlib as a worrying change in the nature of the conflict. He warned that 5 international armies active inside Syria increase the danger of a wider international conflagration. Close to 1 million people have been displaced by the Syrian regime's recent offensives. U.S. Special Representative for Syria, James Jeffries, says there's no consensus in Washington over support to Turkey in Syria's Idlib. He said this is due to Ankara's purchase of the Russian S-400 defense system. Speaking in Istanbul, Jeffries said Turkey's acquiring of Russian defense system is a matter of serious concern. He said the U.S. had already offered humanitarian assistance and information sharing with Turkey. The representative said Washington was pressing European allies for a significant contribution. Earlier, U.S. Ambassador to Ankara, David Satterfield, said that the country had received Turkey's request for the use of Patriot systems. The Syrian regime's Russian-backed assault on Idlib has forced over 1 million people from their homes. Many of them are women and children with nowhere to go. Most have been forced to camp in fields, schools, and mosques. We'll look into the miserable plight of displaced Syrians in this report.
Russian-backed government forces sparked one of the 9-year-old Syrian civil war's worst humanitarian disasters in December when they launched their deadly offensive on Idlib. The assault has forced nearly 1 million people to leave the city. Many of them can now be found in camps at the Idlib football stadium.
This is a football pitch. It's no good for people to live in, for tents or for a camp or anything like that. It has none of the essentials.
The United Nations says war has deprived some 280,000 children of an education in northwestern Syria.
I left my house 4 months ago because of the bombing. They destroyed my home and they had to remove me from the underneath the rubble. I spent 4 months in hospitals, suffering from wounds in my legs and infections.
Turkey, which already hosts some 3.7 million Syrian migrants, says it cannot handle another wave of refugees. Thousands of displaced Syrians stranded at the border say they have nowhere to go but Turkey, from where they hope to reach Europe.
We are a group of people that has an enemy after us, an enemy that has driven us to the borders. Now that we are at the borders, the only solution before us is to enter Turkey, and from Turkey to Europe. Any country that we can go to, we have nowhere else to go. That is our only solution.
UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Mark Lowcock says over half of the 1 million people displaced from Idlib are children. Currently, they are living without adequate shelter or any sanitation facilities. Turkey and the EU are at loggerheads over where to send the refugees, and Syria is refusing to stop its assault. As such, there is no end to the disaster in sight.
In Iraq, protesters have continued staging demonstrations in the southern city of Basra despite the outbreak of coronavirus. Masked demonstrators chanted slogans against the Iraqi government. Protesters said the political elite of the country are more dangerous than the coronavirus threat. He said they have taken several precautionary measures in order to continue their protests. The demonstrator said they sprayed disinfectants and distributed masks among the protesters. Iraq announced its first coronavirus death in the capital Baghdad, along with the cancellation of the religious congregations. In Iran, a health ministry spokesman has reported 15 more deaths from the new coronavirus, raising the death toll to 107. In a televised speech, he said there were 591 new cases of infected people in the last 24 hours, pushing the total number of infections to over 3,500. Earlier, the health minister announced all schools and universities will be closed until the end of the Iranian calendar year on 20th of March. A number of senior Iranian officials have contracted the virus. Among the latest is the head of the emergency medical services, Pir Hussein Kolivant. Globally, more than 95,000 people have been diagnosed with COVID-19. Meanwhile, Iran has temporarily released more than 54,000 prisoners in an effort to combat the spread of the disease in crowded jails. Judiciary spokesman said the inmates were allowed out of prison after testing negative for COVID-19 and posting bail. British Health Minister Matt Hancock has warned of tough weeks ahead in the battle to combat the spread of the new coronavirus, but he said the government was not planning to shut schools and universities at this stage. Addressing the British Chamber of Commerce meeting, Hancock said with clear determination that the UK can see the outbreak through. He said scientific advice suggested that cancelling large public events brought no benefits if people undertook basic hygiene measures. The minister said the government was looking to provide extra support for those who aren't eligible for statutory sick pay.
I will always prioritise protection of life, but we will seek to minimise the social and economic disruption too. Because the scientific advice is very clear that going too far or too fast carries risks of its own. Ultimately, we're working to a timetable that is set by the progress of the virus itself. With 85 confirmed positive cases in the UK, shutting down all our schools and universities, for example, would not have a clinical benefit at this stage.
Meanwhile, the high demand for protective masks shows no signs of slowing down as the new coronavirus spreads around the world. Pharmacies are reporting shortages as factories try to meet the demand by increasing output. Retailers are also running out of other items such as disinfectant hand wash gels. More in this report.
Before the coronavirus outbreak, China was the world's center for face mask production. But the country's mask factories are now catering to China's needs, and with global demand rising, other countries have had to pick up the ball. This factory in Brazil has upped production by 25%, but still cannot keep up with new orders.
Our production increased by around 25% for the capacity that we have today, but the demand was very high. It's even difficult to say what the numbers were. Management had inquiries from all over the world. We continue to prioritize production and service for our local customers from the national industry, but the demand comes from China, Europe, North America, and Asia.
The WHO has raised alarm over the situation, saying there were no longer enough masks to protect health workers and infected people. Medical workers worldwide are also urging people not to engage in panic buying.
We have put orders into the big suppliers because we have requests from really ill patients who actually really have to protect themselves. Those are the important people.
Meanwhile, pharmacies around the world are also running short on other supplies.
We don't have any disinfectant gel at all at the moment. You can't find it anywhere. We're not being shipped any. There's a shortage everywhere.
Prior to the coronavirus outbreak, China could produce up to 20 million masks a day. Today, its local demand alone stands at around 50 million a day, with many factories shuttered down. As such, there is no easy solution to the shortage of masks.
It's time for a short break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. The US has accused Russia of violating the Open Skies Treaty that is designed to improve transparency and confidence between both the militaries. Defense Secretary Mark Esper told a congressional hearing that Russia was blocking the US from conducting military exercise overflights. Esper said Moscow denied flights over the Baltic Sea city of Kaliningrad and near Georgia as permitted by the 18-year-old agreement. He said he had raised the issue last month in the meeting with NATO defense ministers. The deal allows the country's military to conduct limited surveillance flights over another each year on short notice. The aircraft can survey the territory below, collecting information and pictures of military installations and activities. In the Vietnamese port city of Da Nang, the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt has arrived to commemorate 25 years of normalization of ties between Washington and Hanoi. Accompanied by the cruiser USS Bunker Hill, the Roosevelt became only the second U.S. aircraft carrier to make a port call in Vietnam since 1975. Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet Admiral John Aquilino and U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam, Daniel Crichtonbrink, came on board to welcome the crew. Later, they attended a welcoming ceremony hosted by Vice Chairman of Da Nang People's Committee. At the news conference, both Admiral Aquilino and Ambassador Crichtonbrink praised Vietnam and the U.S.'s efforts to become partners.
I think the visit of the Roosevelt and Admiral Aquilino also shows our shared commitment with our partners in the region to the principles that we share regarding our desire to see a rules-based order in the region, peaceful resolution of disputes, and respect for international law.
In Nigeria, 223 children, including 10 girls, have been cleared of suspected ties with armed groups. The UN Children's Fund says the children were released from the Nigerian Army's administrative custody. UNICEF representative in Nigeria, Peter Hawkins, said some of the children were missing for up to 4 to 5 years and presumed dead by their families. He said this is a huge step forward and one to be welcomed and celebrated. The UN body said the children will now immediately enter a program that will help them reintegrate into the society. UNICEF is working with Nigerian authorities to help the reintegration programs for all children formerly associated with non-state armed groups. In Israel's elections, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has once again fallen short of capturing the majority he needs to form a government. After 99% votes have been counted, Netanyahu's right-wing bloc holds 58 seats, 3 short of the 61 required. Israel is reportedly heading towards more political paralysis as both main parties were unable to win a decisive majority in the general election. Yesterday, Netanyahu considered he did not have the parliamentary support to form a new government straight away. Netanyahu's Likud led the way with 36 seats ahead of challenger Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party with 33 seats. Experts say the country may need a 4th election unless the rivals reach a settlement to form a government. In France, President Emmanuel Macron's government has survived 2 no-confidence motions in the parliament. The opposition tabled the resolutions after the government decided to force through the pension reforms without a vote. French lawmakers in the National Assembly accused Macron of showing dictatorial behavior. The government argues that Article 49.3 of the French Constitution allows for a bill to bypass Parliament. The opposition and trade unions have been protesting against the plans since 5th of December. The government hopes to pass the law by the summer, but a record 41,000 proposed amendments slowed down the process. French unions and the opposition have planned strikes and protests for 31st of March. Ukraine's parliament has approved the new cabinet after ousting Prime Minister Oleksiy Honcharuk. 277 lawmakers voted in favor of the 13 ministers nominated by the newly appointed Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. The parliamentarians approved President Volodymyr Zelensky's choices for defense and foreign ministers. The new cabinet will replace the previous government led by Prime Minister Honcharuk, which lasted for only 6 months. Lawmakers also passed a law allowing units from foreign armed forces to take part in the multinational exercises within the country. The European Commission has released $34.5 million in humanitarian aid to help the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh and Myanmar. The EU Commissioner for Crisis Management says Brussels is committed to supporting refugees and host communities in Cox's Bazar. In a statement, Janaz Lenarchis said it's important to maintain support for the people development and who are dependent on aid to survive. The commissioner said nearly $24.5 million will be used to help the vulnerable groups and improve disaster management in Bangladesh. He said $10 million will be spent in Myanmar to help the communities in the conflict-hit states of Rakhine, Kachin and Shan. According to Amnesty International, over 750,000 Rohingya Muslims fled Myanmar after forces launched a crackdown. In India, a court has issued fresh death warrants for the execution of the 4 convicts in the Nirbhaya gang rape and murder case for 20th of March. Now deceased victim Jyoti Singh became known as Nirbhaya following the incident as a symbol of courage in the face of violence against women. The death warrant was issued a day after President Ramnath Kovind rejected the mercy petition of convict Pawan Gupta. The court issued the new date of execution after the Delhi government apprised it that the convicts have exhausted all their legal remedies. Speaking to media, the victim's mother, Asha Devi, hoped the convicts would be hanged on this final date. The 4 convicts had gang raped Jyoti Singh and assaulted her with an iron rod on 16th of December 2012. She died of her injuries later that month. In Pakistan, 14 people have been killed and 35 others injured when a 5-story building collapsed in the port city of Karachi. In a statement, a Karachi metropolitan official said the injured had been shifted to hospital. The Chief Minister of Sindh has directed the city commissioner to implement rescue and relief operations. Contingents of police, army and rangers were also sent to the affected area to assist in rescue operations. Earlier, the local building control authority had directed over 380 residential buildings to be vacated after they were declared dangerous. 29 people are now known to have died in flooding and mudslides across the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Hopes are fading as rescue workers search for 25 people who are still missing. Authorities say the search operation remains ongoing in the city of Guarujá, Santos and São Vicente. They say most of the missing are residents of the hillside favela of Vila Baena, where homes fell apart under the force of mudslides and rain. Local government said 2 firefighters were killed in rescue attempts in Sao Paulo state. 20 people have been wounded as a high-speed TGV train derailed in eastern France. The state rail company SNCF said the seriously wounded train driver was immediately evacuated by helicopter. Authorities said the train carrying 348 passengers derailed near Ignaheim in the Bosrine area. Officials said a major landslip caused the accident as it was traveling between Strasbourg and Paris. Other trains have been rerouted to avoid interruption in services. In 2015, a TGV derailment killed 11 people on the same route during a test run prior to the line's entry into service. Indigenous people make up 2% of Argentina's population of 43 million. They are limited to far-flung areas of the country where water pollution, unhygienic conditions and malnutrition are killing indigenous children. Let's look at the situation over there in this report.
Argentina has around 18 different indigenous groups who remain invisible in mainstream society. Most live in remote parts of the country where they are deprived of life's basic necessities. This includes the Wichi community, who suffer from lack of clean water, availability of food and pollution. 8 of its children have died within the last month. Local hospital beds are filled with children battling malnutrition and other health issues. Hospital authorities say malnutrition is not the only issue. The children are also suffering from diarrhea.
There are children that have problems. They have diarrhea, they vomit and lose weight. There are times that they are taken to Tartagal and recover there, but when they return, the problem returns because of the water. This is not safe water.
The community also has one of the highest rates of infant mortality in the country.
The place they use as a water source is already either contaminated or has high standards of salinization or even chemical products from the extraction site at very shallow depths, or because they store the water in containers that have been used before for chemicals associated with agriculture, which cause them to have many gastrointestinal diseases, diarrhea, malnutrition, and above all, dehydration.
Indigenous people face an appalling plight all over Argentina.
The situation is a disaster on all levels. Education, health, access to jobs, access to water, life expectancy, infant mortality, malnutrition, everything. There is no good news. What can be done? There is no long-term plan, not a short-term plan, which is what constantly happens.
¿Qué se puede hacer?
The country is also struggling with the financial depression. Inflation hovers at above 50% and the poverty rate is currently at 35.4%. The country's indigenous communities, who have been economically vulnerable historically, have been especially hard hit.
In Mexico, conflict fueled by the drug trade has left tens of thousands of people in secret, unmarked graves. The families of these missing persons say the authorities have taken little action over the issue. One group of activists has turned to drone technology to address the problem themselves. More in this report.
Mexico is one of the most violent countries in the world. Since 2006, an escalating drug war between rival cartels has resulted in the deaths of over 115,000 people, as well as the disappearance of at least 60,000 others, most of whom end up in unmarked graves.
These are places where members of organized crime groups hid bodies of kidnapped and murdered people. Normally, we come to these places to search and locate human remains.
Desperate for closure, one group of parents affected by this tragedy are using drones to find as many of these graves as they can. They say northern Mexico has seen so much carnage over the years, its entire landscape is changing because of these mass burial sites.
We compare drone images with photographs from previous years and we can see the differences in the land today. Discoloration changes in the earth, constructions, mounds of stones or dirt.
This is a dangerous job. Not only do these people risk drawing the wrath of ruthless drug cartels, but also the Mexican police and military, who have often used extrajudicial methods in the country's long war on drugs. Most tragically of all, none of this has been able to put a dent in the growing power of these criminal groups.
More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Welcome back. In the Egyptian region of Nubia, a love of crocodiles goes back to the days of Egyptian pharaohs. Today, Nubians raise them as tame pets to attract the tourists. This report tells us how they exactly do it.
Nubia in the south of Egypt is a land with a very long history, which includes a fascination for crocodiles. In the past, they were worshipped and mummified. Now they are domesticated and kept as pets. In Gharb Sohail, a village beside the Nile in southern Egypt, a baby crocodile sits on Mamdouh Hussein's shoulder. This, unsurprisingly, brings in the tourists, and that is the idea. Tame crocs bring in the tourists who spend their money here.
We bring up baby crocodiles and raise them to grow up near Nasser Lake. We raise them since they are babies, so they grow up with us and their aggressive nature is tempered. So they would be similar to any other pet that we might be raising at home.
Keeping crocodiles became a way to supplement incomes and promote their heritage. Victors snap selfies with the lounging lizards, while villagers regale them with Nubian folk tales. A stuffed crocodile on the door of a house shows that the homeowner keeps the large reptiles as pets.
The average lifespan of a crocodile ranges from 70 to 80 years. And as they grow older, they could reach a length of 3 or 4 meters. The owner slaughters it and mummifies its body and then puts it in front of his house as a decoration to attract tourists.
Nubians have a tradition of crocodile taxidermy, going back thousands of years, one they still maintain today. And the way they do it now remains true to the centuries-old techniques.
OPEC agrees to output cut of 1.5 million barrels per day for the second quarter to support prices amid the coronavirus outbreak. Iranian Oil Minister Bijan Zaganeh confirmed this in a press briefing after a meeting of OPEC ministers in Vienna. He said the ministers want non-OPEC allies to contribute cuts of 500,000 barrels per day out of total 1.5 million. But Russia, the biggest non-OPEC producer, still needs to signal its approval. The IMF, World Bank, and several central banks have pledged billions of dollars and cut interest rates, all to help the global economy stay afloat during the coronavirus crisis. More in this report.
Like many people around the world, the economy has been rattled by the coronavirus outbreak and pandemic. The international economic outlook, already battered by trade wars, looks shaky at best. The IMF and the World Bank say the pandemic has swept hopes for stronger growth this year to one side. It predicts GDP growth in 2020 will be the slowest since the 2008 financial crisis. To help fight off the virus, the IMF has announced a $50 billion support fund, while the World Bank has committed $12 billion in aid. The UN says Chinese exports are believed to have slipped back by 2% in February, costing countries and their industries $50 billion.
This also correlates directly to exports and also implies a 2% drop in overall exports. This results in this will show that there's a ripple effect throughout the global economy and to the tune of $50 billion fall in exports across the world.
Major central banks, including the US Federal Reserve, have cut key interest rates to give their economies a shot in the arm. The US House of Representatives has approved an $8.3 billion bill to combat the spread of the virus.
And we were pleased to learn that just shortly ago, the House of Representatives passed a federal funding bill by a virtually unanimous margin. It will now move to the Senate. And the legislation implements the President's vision to ensure that not only do our federal agencies have the support and resources that they need.
After turbulence in global markets, short sellers in the US have made the best use of the opportunity, making over $50 billion in profit.
U.S. stock markets have plunged at the open after a massive relief rally in the previous session. The markets are still reeling through the jerks of fast-spreading coronavirus. Decline in the shares of Boeing and Goldman Sachs sank the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index. The indices of S&P 500 and Nasdaq Composite also traded sharply lower. World oil prices also faced a mixed trend despite growing indications of an OPEC output cut. European stock markets are trading lower as investors continue to wrestle with uncertainty despite stimulus hopes. London's FTSE 100 is trading over 0.5% lower after Capita stocks plunge over 15%. Evra stocks fell over 10%, while ITV shares lost 5.5%. Frankfurt's DAX has lost a fraction. CAC 40 in Paris is trading marginally lower. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng led the gains, closing over 2% higher after shares of the insurer AIA soared nearly 3.5%. Shanghai Composite gained nearly 2%. Meanwhile, international Brent crude oil price sparred early gains and is trading over 0.5% higher. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Stay tuned. Now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus Special.